Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, dear members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. As a board member of ENAR, as already mentioned, the European Network Against Racism, I welcome the decision of the LIBE Committee to hold a specific agenda point on the highly worrying increase in racism towards people of African descent in Europe. I thank you for inviting us to contribute to this topic. This is the first official discussion specifically on Afrophobia in LIBE, following several events organized in this House by ENAR and ARDI, which is the Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup. But let me be crystal clear, 30 minutes are not enough to have a meaningful discussion and plan steps for action. I can only encourage you to continue this effort and organize a longer hearing on this topic, to inform the production of a LIBE-driven resolution to call for action by member states and the European Commission. But first, a few words about ENAR. ENAR is the only pan-European network of NGOs working to combat racism and related discriminations that combines advocacy and cross-communities actions. ENAR and its members have a strong expertise on Afrophobia as well as on other forms of racism. We've notably produced a book on people of African descent and Black Europeans, as well as a comparative report, as already mentioned, on Afrophobia in the EU. We wanted to counter excuses for inaction due to the lack of data. You may find both publications in the room. We brought them with us, or you can also check them on our ENAR's website. Afrophobia as such is a specific form of racism that refers to any act of violence or discrimination fueled by historical abuses and negative stereotyping and leading to the exclusion and dehumanization of people of African descent. Afrophobia refers to anti-Black racism and has nothing to do with a pathological phobia. Likewise, homophobia or Islamophobia are not irrational fears, but forms of discrimination. Anti-Black racism correlates to historically repressive structures of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade as recognized by a recent blog from the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights. There's no reliable equality data in the EU, so it is hard to have definite figures. It is estimated that there are 15 million people of African descent and Black Europeans in Europe. It is clear that people of African descent are one of the largest group growing minorities in Europe. They are people of African descent in all EU member states, from very low percentage in the Baltic countries to 5.4% of the population in the Netherlands, for example. Some belong to recent migrant communities, while some are European citizens and their families have been in Europe for several generations and centuries. People of African descent and Black Europeans are victims of particularly violent racist crime. The first EU MIDAS survey by the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, the FRA, revealed that 33% of sub-Saharan Africans in Europe have been victims of at least one racially motivated crime in the 12 months preceding the interviews. For instance, Afro-Swedes are the Swedish minority which is most exposed to hate crimes, according to statistics, indicating a 24% increase since 2008. In 2015, one man stabbed 3 persons to death, and in what was qualified as a racist attack in Trollhättan school in Sweden. Discriminatory policing and ethnic profiling are long-standing issues. In Paris, research by the Open Society Justice Initiative showed that people perceived as Black were overall 6 times more likely to be stopped by police than white people. In the UK, Black people were 6 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police than white people, according to the latest police data. In Germany, the repeated denial of the fact that Black people are being racially profiled leads to the failure to effectively investigate and prosecute perpetrators of racial profiling. In numerous European countries where there is data, we see that Black people are overrepresented in prisons. In addition, 2017 has seen numerous examples of violence against Black people at the hands of the police, including the death of Russian Charles in July in the UK, and the violent abusive arrest of Theo Louhaka in France in February. In Germany, the case of Uri Jallo, who died in a police cell in the 1990s, will finally be reopened for investigation this year. We know that people of African descent are particularly underrepresented in seats of power. For the few Black politicians, racism and discrimination remains an issue fought on a daily basis, as the racist onslaught of MP Cecile Kyenge shows. Across all indicators, education, health, criminal justice, employment, Black people are often the most discriminated against. Employment, for instance, is one area where there are significant legislative protections already in place at EU level, but the reality is that discrimination still takes place at alarming rates. Stereotypes about Africa and people of African descent that date back to colonialism are still predominant in almost every single European country. In the Netherlands, for instance, blackfacing, which is the use of Black makeup to represent a stereotyped characteristics of Black people, is still widely used in the St. Nicholas or Black Pete celebrations. Changes in migration and asylum policies and practice impact both people of African descent who are recent migrants as well as Black Europeans with a migration background. Public and politic discourse that attempts to differentiate between legitimate asylum claims and economic migrants tends to demonize entire groups, in particular African migrants. Disturbing reports of sub-Saharan dying at sea trying to reach Europe have been frequent. EU member states have the obligation under EU and international law to ensure Black people enjoy the rights to equal treatment and non-discrimination. In 2015, the UN General Assembly also proclaimed the UN Decade for People of African Descent to work in spirit of recognition, justice, and development. Despite these obligations, racial discrimination and racist crimes are widespread. It is high time that this situation receives proper attention. There are many more issues that should be addressed, and we hope there will be in future a dedicated hearing and debates around resolutions from this House. For now, ENAR calls in particular for four next steps. First, the LIBE Committee should adopt a resolution on combating Afrophobia in the European Union. Second, the European institutions should mark the UN International Decade for People of African Descent and participate in the upcoming regional conference in Geneva in November this year. Third, the European Commission should appoint a coordinator with special authority to combat Afrophobia, just as for anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. And fourth, the European Commission should adopt an EU framework encouraging member states to adopt action plans and collect equality data based on self-determination. To conclude, I would like to insist on the fact that it's important to tackle all forms of racism jointly, together with anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Gyptism, so as to show us all forms of racism and hatred are of concern to all and are equally important to address. The fundamental difference is that, unlike for people of African descent, the historical realities of many of other groups are recognized and politically acknowledged. MEPs and commissioners have been quick to denounce alt-right protests in the US, and rightly so. But we wish they would put the same level of passion to denounce racism in Europe, because in Europe too, there have been instances of black people being killed in the street, raped by police, verbally and physically abused. There might not be such a history of race-related tensions in Europe as in the US, but the current situation is as concerning, except that in Europe, denial of racism is much higher. Thank you for your attention.